when I talk about going out and getting some sun, I want you near a tree, I want you in the grass, I want you walking around. And what's really amazing optically is that most people think about getting UVB and UVA from direct sunlight. It's actually not where we get it. What happens is that the atmosphere, you look up at a blue sky and you say, oh, that's blue. Why is it blue? It's because there's what's called Rayleigh scattering. The light comes in from the sun, scatters off the atmosphere. Well, it's actually scattering more of the UV. So what you get when you're outdoors under a blue sky is essentially what they call 2 pi steradian, a hemisphere of UV coming in from all angles. And you think about it, it makes sense. If I need UV to go into if I just had one source of UV and it was just coming, all the shadows didn't get anything. That's not what it does. And the same thing happens in the near infrared, so we're getting from all different directions.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Tracy Donegan. Today I'm speaking with Scott Zimmerman, an optical engineer and light researcher, about the potential harms of indoor lighting on fertility and pregnancy. So if you're trying to conceive or are already pregnant, this is an episode you don't want to miss. And now I bring you Scott Zimmerman. Everybody, you are very welcome to a special edition of the Tracy Donegan podcast. And today I am really excited to welcome Scott Zimmerman, who is an optics engineer. So Scott's going to tell us in a minute exactly what that is for people like myself who don't have a lot of work with optics engineers as midwives. He's also a light researcher and has been exploring the impact of non-visible light on the human body. And his research has led to some really fascinating insights into how our bodies utilize light and infrared light from the sun and the continuous production of melatonin, which, although often referred to as a hormone of darkness, now Scott has realized that our mitochondria are actually producing melatonin throughout the day. So I've gone down many rabbit holes in the last year learning about light biology. And I'm sure, like many people listening, I just assumed that melatonin was to do with sleep and darkness, which it is. But as a midwife and a birth doula, my basic understanding of melatonin was that it works really well with oxytocin in labor. And the worst thing we can do to a woman in labor is put on all the lights, because we're going to suppress that melatonin and her body won't work as optimally as we had hoped. So we are now looking at studies that are showing that living under artificial light can change labor patterns. It can affect our blood glucose and many, many more complications that we weren't expecting. And the fact that it impacts labor patterns can be great for looking at technologies to reduce preterm birth, but not for healthy, well women that are just going through a normal labor. Scott, thank you so much for joining me today. And first of all, tell us a little bit about what is an optics engineer, and then, please tell us a little bit about your work with light and, take it away.
Well, optical engineer basically is focused on lighting, displays, those type of technologies, and communications and that type. I've been doing it for 40 years. I have 85 issued patents in the area. Did everything from backlights for displays to lighting. And about a few years ago, I started looking into the idea of trying to make better lighting systems. So I have a small company. We make some light sources that we sell that are designed to mimic sunlight. But what I was surprised to find is that there was almost no work that had been done to look at how does light interact with the body itself. People think about it, I go out and I get exposed to sunlight, that's on my surface of my skin, that's it. Well, it turns out that for the majority of the solar spectrum, or good portions of the solar spectrum, that's not what happens. It actually penetrates into the body and interacts with various structures and within the body that we're just starting to understand. But, the bottom line is that what we've done, people don't understand this, but we've gone in the last several decades, we've gone through the largest reduction in solar exposure in human history, along with the largest increase in artificial light exposure at night. Those two things are happening simultaneously. They're exactly the opposite of what we get when we're, our grandparents and our kids, when I was a kid, we would be outside, we would be in the light, we'd play outside and under building tree houses, all this other stuff.
Yeah.
That doesn't occur anymore. We now have a very structured society where children are taken from one venue to another. They're always under artificial lighting. And what we're finding is that, my focus has been on understanding the optics of how light interacts with the body, because I believe that then reveals mechanisms that the body and assumptions that the body makes. The body assumes that it is exposed from UVB all the way out to far infrared, which is a span of about from 200, what we call wavelength, 250 nanometers, out to beyond 3 microns and beyond 10 microns. And I've been lucky enough to work with some individuals that in the biology world that are willing to, like Len Jeffries and Bob Fosbury and Russ Ritter and others, and Professor John Louis. And we've been doing, it's kind of like kind of an odd mix of people coming together. We have an astrophysicist, we have a biologist, we have an optical engineer, we have a gentleman that's been trying to deal with the black population's low vitamin D levels for decades. But to a T, they all said the same thing. We need to understand how light interacts with biological systems, and we don't know it right now. And so, that's been kind of my focus. And, what has happened is that in the last, couple decades, we have gone from something where there was this amount of spectrum, a huge amount of spectrum, down to something where we only provide less than 10% of the spectrum, the wavelengths, the colors of light, as you say. Because the assumption was made is that the only thing that sunlight provided was the ability to see. Most people are able to see, and so it was very easy. But what people don't understand is the eye has such a limited range of response that it's very easy to trick you. An LED contains no UV, contains no near infrared. They threw it away to try and generate higher efficiency light bulbs with the assumption that those wavelengths did nothing. And they were wrong. And in fact, not only they're wrong, what we have created now is an artificial environment that is actually harmful, especially to children, women, pregnant women in particular, and the black population and some of the elderly. Some of us white males, we're fine. We can deal with anything. From the standpoint of optically, it's kind of interesting, but women have thinner skins, literally, and that's not a negative, it's a positive. They have less collagen, they have a different fat distribution in their skin, therefore they respond more to a higher degree to changes in spectrum than males do. Children are even more susceptible because they are smaller physically, so the light that penetrates into the body, a higher percentage of their cells are engaged. And when I did start doing some of these little optical models of various things, rather than the eye, one of the ones I started on was the fetus, the womb. And as I told you, I had a set of twins, my wife and I had twins. When she was full, she had 13 and a half pounds of baby, she was translucent. You could see through her, type thing. But to me, it's just the most amazing optical effect, because what happens is during the first part of the pregnancy, all the shorter wavelengths are blocked by the mother's skin, and only the near infrared goes in, and it bounces around within the room, kind of like having a little integrating sphere type thing with the baby inside type. And so, but it's all kind of bathing the baby in this near infrared, and the infrared, and then as the pregnancy progresses, the woman's skin starts to stretch, which allows in other wavelengths. So it's kind of like a filtering effect. And there's indications that may have an effect on certain cytokines that are linked into autism, that have on eye development, things of that nature, and melatonin characteristics. But in general, it's just the most amazing optical mechanism that as the pregnancy progresses, eventually the full spectrum is being exposed to the baby, and then after birth, of course, then you have it's kind of like a process that the body is based on the assumption that it has exposure to a predominantly near-infrared emitter, which the sun is. Not only is the sun, and I'd like to take a quick second to kind of explain what sunlight is. Yeah, we know it's UV all the way out to the infrared, but that's not really what our body is designed for. Our body is actually designed optically under the assumption that we're in a surrounding, like the green grass, the green trees, the dirt. It turns out that all those components absorb visible light and UV, but they highly reflect near-infrared and longer wavelengths. So therefore, it shifts when we are actually in our normal environment outdoors. It shifts the spectrum so that there's a higher proportion of near-infrared to visible and UV. It's kind of like a pair of sunglasses. And the body appears to be designed to absorb that. And same thing happens in your skull. Your outer skin and bone essentially absorb the near-infrared are the UV and the visible. The near-infrared penetrates. If you look at, like the amniotic fluid, the cerebral spinal fluid has a peak transmission at 850 nanometers in the near-infrared. So what happens? The near-infrared goes into your forehead, into your head. It bounces around, and it actually is light-guided by the cerebral spinal fluid down into the fissures of the brain. And if you look at the cross-section of the brain, you'll see that the gray matter is all on the outside. So the body's doing these optical things, mechanisms, under, like I say, the assumption that there's an excess. There's always, in nature, there is always an excess of near-infrared to visible, in the optical watts terms. When you're sitting baking yourself in the sun, it's about equal. But the minute you get any kind of dirt around you, or sun, or trees, or grass, it shifts it to 3 or 4, and in shade it can be 5 to 1. So it's always this. But what we did in our artificial environment is we knocked that down to 0. And so the only thing you get when you're inside, not just because of the lighting and the displays, but also the low-E glass windows are designed to block all the near-infrared from coming in. So what I'd say for most people is they need to rethink most people, when they say go out and get in the sun, they go out and we're going to roast on a beach. That's not what we're designed to do. We are expected to be going inside, going for a walk in the park, going around. And it's this function of our surroundings that we don't take into account. Like I say, last thing I'd suggest to anybody is go out on the beach and and scorch themselves. My grandfather was a dairy farmer, and he would have his straw hat, he'd have his overalls, he'd have his cotton shirt that went up to here. Well, it turns out that I measured the straw hat, and I measured some of these, and Bob Fosbury's done some amazing pictures of how it translates through the clothes. The near-infrared goes right on through, and so you get another level of filtration that's associated with always maintaining a high level of near-infrared. And so what we've been doing is trying to develop light sources and stuff that bring back that part, which is very difficult given that the government and their regulations are now trying to essentially prevent us from doing it. But, so that's kind of what I'd like people to think about. When I talk about going out and getting some sun, I want you near a tree, I want you in the grass, I want you walking around. And what's really amazing optically is that most people think about getting UVB and UVA from direct sunlight. It's actually not where we get it. What happens is that the atmosphere, you look up at a blue sky, and you say, oh, that's blue. Why is it blue? It's because there's what's called Rayleigh scattering. The light comes in from the sun, scatters off the atmosphere. Well, it's actually scattering more of the UV. So what you get when you're outdoors under a blue sky is essentially 200, what they call 2 pi steradian, a hemisphere of UV coming in from all angles. And you think about it, it makes sense. If I need UV to go into the if I just had one source of UV and it was just coming, all the shadows didn't get anything. That's not what the Earth it does. And the same thing happens in the near infrared. So we're getting from all different directions. So I guess the bottom line is that you need to understand that sunlight is the best way to get it is to go sit. As Bob Fosbury always likes to say, he said Isaac Newton didn't discover gravity because an apple fell on his head. It was because he's underneath a tree. But, Bohr and Heisenberg used to go for walks in the parks, and they said how that actually they had their best ideas walking around in the park. Now, of course, they are also trying to prevent the Nazis from listening into their conversations, but that's a separate issue. But anyway, that's what I'd like people to understand is that go out, walk in this park, get in the shade. Even in the winter, go out, get some of the canopy that we're getting. And so, that's what I guess I'd say about what sunlight really is to me, at least. So.
And it's so interesting when, kind of, as we mentioned before we started recording, like I've gone down this rabbit hole, kind of starting at the kind of the red light therapy and the PBM science, and kind of, the more I'm learning, the more I'm coming back to, we need to be less under these lights, these artificial light, and getting more of those near infrared and all that good stuff, and the vitamins and the vitamin D, and so. Like, what are your thoughts on the fact that we evolved for whatever 3 billion years to be outdoors and to be under sunlight? That in the last 100 years or so that we've changed our living environments so completely that now, like, pregnant women aren't, well, most women I think in the modern world are not getting any near infrared at all, and never mind the full spectrum. So when I think about, shift workers and like my midwifery colleagues and doulas that will work, various, our circadian rhythm can be all over the place, that there's no, like when we go to work, if we're pregnant, we will have a risk assessment of, you're not to lift boxes this heavy and you're to stay out of, this room because it has, toxic fumes, but we're not doing any risk assessments on the impact of being under artificial light during pregnancy and not getting any. Do you think we're getting to that point that we need to start looking a little bit more seriously at the fact that we've, as you mentioned, like we have completely eliminated the near infrared and these important wavelengths for reproductive health, and now we're in this artificial environment that is having an impact on like our blood glucose levels, and there's a ton of research out there looking at shift workers. Because they're working under artificial light.
Yeah, well, when you look at it, historically, once you got the invention of the incandescent light bulb, the incandescent light bulb is overkill. It has more near infrared. It's like 10-to-1 ratio. And so whenever we may have been working under fluorescence during the day or something that late starting in the 50s, but we still came home to an incandescent lit, read a book to our kids at night, and which sets you up for having higher levels of melatonin and not the suppression. I don't have a problem with circadian. I believe in circadian. That's not the issue. My problem is that melatonin is produced in all our cells, not just the pineal gland. And I think that's a fundamental, when I started working with Russ, and he's been for 40 years trying to get people to understand that the pineal gland is a supplement, because when we sleep, the brain is still functioning at 80% of its capacity. It's generating all kinds of reactive oxygen species. Melatonin is necessary. It provides an excellent way for melatonin to be distributed out to cells that need a little extra. But when we saw the data from Theron, where he actually took people and put them on stair steppers and measured during during the morning, they found that melatonin goes up like a rocket once you're doing heavy exercise. So does cortisol. Totally opposed to this is 9 a.m. in the morning. So it's totally opposed to the issues that are what people think about when they think about circadian. Circadian is a baseline. It is a wish list, basically. And the only way to really measure it is to put a person in a dark area, repose, no activity, nothing, and then you can actually see the change in melatonin in the blood supply. But if you do anything, as Russ used to say, Scott, I can do the same thing if I come along with a stick and whack you on the back, as turning on a blue light. Because the reality is that all our cells, all the mitochondria are producing. And that was the key moment, I think, in the paper we did on transient responses, is that, in those cases, very seldom, if ever, there's only like 4 or 5 papers done this way, where they measured the change in hormone levels during the stressor, during exercise, and what it comes out clear. And then Gao did similar work where he started doing stuff with cortisol. And what you find is that when you do a stressor, during a stressor, within 10 minutes, there's a rapid spike in cortisol and melatonin in the blood supply, especially during heavy exercise. And so the body is generating excessive amounts, but it's using it locally. The purpose of melatonin in each cell is to deal with the reactive oxygen species locally. Because the reality is, by the time I try and do something, the body tries to respond systemically, you've either done the wrong thing or whatever. So all our cells, and the deeper we dig, the more we understand, all these cells are capable of protecting themselves. They have to. They don't have a choice. I can't wait 15 minutes for this thing to change in my blood plasma, and even if it did, it would probably be the wrong amount for what I need to deal with. So there's this whole system of local control or local response that has been totally missing from the debate. And that's what we kind of tried to show in that biology paper and in the melatonin research paper, is that there is a transient. During these transients, you can see how the hormones are responding in a time frame of 1 to 20 minutes. And it just makes sense when you think about it from an engineering standpoint. How can a control system not have the capability to do that, given the complexity of the different stressors? Look you get a sunburn from a swimsuit. Red spot, clear spot. 2 different responses needed. Yeah. So that's kind of one of the things that we've been trying to get people to understand is that the pineal gland, great, but it's really more of a supplement rather than the controlling factor. And I think that would help people with sleep. I used to put up hay, and I spent all day out there putting up hay. I slept like a baby when I came home because I have been generating tons and tons of different melatonin, to an excess, versus somebody who's stuck sitting here like we're doing, mm-hmm. All day for 8 hours. They're not getting exercise. It's not like there's one thing, but the bottom line is that we've created exactly the opposite of what we've essentially evolved under for millions of years. And, so that's what we've been trying to do and raise awareness that, you need to go, as you say, go outside. Don't go out and tell me that you got a sunburn. Go outside with a hat on, and essentially pump up your thing. Because what we're really trying to do, especially with mothers, pregnant mother, expecting mothers, you want to be your best. You just do. And so why would you put yourself in this artificial environment that is not your best? And it's free to go outside most places. Now, I believe that's why we're making the lights we are, because I believe that there are a lot of cases. There was a study that typical sunlight exposure for people in some nursing homes was 5 minutes a month. You know, they just don't get outside. And, you know, and then when I started doing the work with John Luis with the black population, because, you know, the reality is, I mean, I do optics. There's a big optical difference between somebody who has dark skin and somebody who has light skin. Now, when we forcibly displace the black population up into the higher latitudes, we basically put them into an environment that they need 3 to 4, based on our measurements, they need 3 to 4 times the amount of near-infrared exposure that someone like you or I need to get the same level of stimulation. Now, that's what John Luis he's been going into churches and all this other stuff, trying to get the black population to understand. Unfortunately, it's all wrapped up in this vitamin D stuff, but there's a reality that the longer wavelengths are actually appears to be improving the body's ability to generate vitamin D, because it turns out that the longer wavelengths, if I take a picture of you or me and anybody and someone with darker skin, you see one's darker skin, one's lighter skin. The minute you get out past about 1100 nanometers in the near infrared and starting into the shortwave, we all look the same. We have black skin and white hair. And it's because water end up being the absorption. Well, it appears that water, that in those longer wavelengths, even though they seem, based on the data you see from all the spectrums that you see of sunlight, it turns out that those longer wavelengths are actually where the highest density of photons occurs, because there's more photons, not the amount of the energy, but the amount of photons. And it appears that is generating high levels of hydrogen peroxide that is then being used by the body to photochemically bleach the same region of the skin, the outer 50 microns, to enhance its ability to be able to oxidize cholesterol. So there's all these interactions that we're starting to see happening, where it's not this is my pet peeve with the photobiomodulation and red light therapy. There is no such thing as a narrowband emitter in nature. It doesn't exist. So now, but the body is using all these different wavelengths, not only individually, but in combinations, to do things that set us up to be maximizing our ability to survive. You know, everybody likes to jump on the blue bandwagon. Blue's bad. And in the case of what we're getting from artificial lighting and from displays, it is bad, because it's only blue. When you look up at a blue sky, that blue sky is not only blue, but if you measure it, you'll find out its majority of it is near infrared and shortwave infrared. We don't see it, but it's actually there. And all the reflections coming in from all the different directions are near infrared. So you get this, when we're exposed to a blue sky, it's not just a blue sky. It's blue broadband with a bunch of other stuff. And what we did is we truncated it all out, and now people are exposed to, kind of like red light therapy, they're exposed to just these little bands, which I totally understand. I'm sure there is a biomarker that will go up. I mean, Glenn's done some amazing work with narrowband LEDs showing glucose levels, CO2 levels. Absolutely happening. But that's not what happens in nature. So I keep on saying that it's kind of like, I think everybody's sensing a deficiency or anemia, and if they go do a little bit of the red, it kind of helps. I'm not saying it doesn't help. But then I will bring up this one other thing, because I think it's a real safety issue. One of the problems I have is that, especially we as Americans, we tend to, if a little bit was good, a lot's better, And unlike, it's kind of like the headlights that we're dealing with now. You have to glance away. Well, in the near infrared, you don't have a glance away response. So I'm concerned that some people are overexposing themselves, looking at the emitters that they think are, it's not that bright. If they could see what the amount of watts that are coming out of those things, you're going to get people that have hurt, or going to get hurt in their eyes or whatever. There was a lot of near-infrared laser jocks that lost their eyesight because they didn't have the ability to see where the beam was. And
Yeah.
so I think that's, I just use a word of caution. I mean, Bob Fosbury and Glenn, when they're doing things, they reflect it off of a wall or a ceiling rather than having it go directly on you. And
Right.
so yeah, if your other midwives are looking at it, just please do me the favor of point it away on let it diffuse off of another surface rather than putting it right onto somebody's face type.
Yeah, no, and I think because so much of this is so new for the idea of light and biology is so new for midwives and for birth workers, was one of the reasons why I was really excited to talk to you. So, but could I just go back to this idea of the pineal gland? So you're saying that's supplementary, that throughout the day we're generating melatonin from our mitochondria, and that's that local effect. So I'm thinking, okay, and again, we don't have research on this, but we're looking at it from a place of like a stressor on the body. So this exercise, you go out and you exercise, you're going to release additional melatonin. So would you say, again, I'm thinking a woman that is deep in labor, there's a huge metabolic demand on her, that her mitochondria should be, supporting
Yeah.
that and creating all of that melatonin and supporting all of that work that's happening. Should be. If
Yeah. Well, and you think about it, if it's the mitochondria, which we believe it is, it's generating the melatonin, or at least in causing response, the amount of mitochondria, the health, the muscle health, and all that other stuff is directly tied into with their ability to generate melatonin. Melatonin has so many benefits on so many levels, but there's a big difference, in my opinion, between taking. Now, Russ would disagree. Russ takes quite a bit of melatonin, and he's done well for himself. But I don't. I personally am not don't take drugs, and I don't take anything I don't have to take.
Because
And
I was thinking of this, because kind of linking into, I'm starting to see trials now where in obstetrics where they're giving supplements of melatonin in an attempt to accelerate labor or to help with an induction of labor. I'm trying to figure out what the mechanism of action could be. If why do we are these women are obviously, there's something going on, that maybe it's mitochondrial dysfunction, or the fact that their mitochondria are a little bit lazy because they're not getting exposed to all of this beautiful outside light. But now we're looking at, if we give women melatonin in labor, I'm like, can we just, okay, do we have to give them a supplement? Could we try a control where we had women out in daylight and see if that had an impact on their labors? And
well, it was interesting. Roger Seaholt has done a number of videos on some of our work, and here recently he had a COVID patient that was struggling, and he said, I really believe that there's a benefit to doing this. He took the patient out with the oxygen, with all the other stuff. He was in pretty bad shape. He said he agreed to do it, but he said, I don't see the point in this. He said we took him out 20 minutes outdoors with the other, nurses and all that, and then brought him back in. And the guy said, I feel so much better. I don't know, to answer your question about, but I think that you're 100% right. They need to have some studies on this thing, because the reality is there are these observational, there's a benefit to having a high level, a good, solid reservoir. I liken it to being, you think about it, there are trillions of mitochondria in the body. If they are capable of generating melatonin, like it appears they are, then that's kind of like a reservoir of capacity that can be delved into for a woman going through labor, and if that's higher, that may provide an advantage. I don't know. But I'm sure that there is definitely, at this point, I think the data, how else are we getting these spikes in blood plasma melatonin during the morning, during exercise, unless it's being generated in the mitochondria, because that's where the muscles are generating tons and tons of reactive oxygen species. It's not like the pineal gland's dumping it in there at 9 o'clock in the morning. At least it's not supposed to be.
Yeah.
So I think that it just opens up a whole new avenue of essentially a way to maybe add it to the list of things that women do to try and be ready to take on labor. Get out and get some sun.
Yeah, and even I'm thinking, because women in Ireland will be watching this and they'll be going, well, if we had a couple of nice days, we could get out and get that sunlight. It's yeah, we're coming into winter, miserable Irish weather where even a bit of cloud cover you can handle, but when it's cold and wet and miserable, the idea of getting your skin out in that. But I guess with the near infrared, it's penetrating. I guess it will penetrate through clothing as well.
Yeah, the Bob did
Levels.
six layers of a good English gentleman's jacket and shirt and all that, and sweater or whatever he calls it. I'm not English, so I can't tell you. But yeah, but it goes through to some extent. But that's why I did a paper on seasonality and I think that a lot of our seasonality is associated with these changes in hormone levels because we're not getting out and getting sun. And I actually had one doctor listening to what we were talking about, and he actually started telling some of his patients, darker skinned patients, you need to move out of Seattle. That's your problem. And it's a hard thing to say, but and people do it. I mean, look at how many people move when they get older, move down to Florida and all these other places.
Yeah,
But
there is. Yeah, I've heard you talk before about on other podcasts about this latitude, is a latitudinal mismatch between on our what our bodies are capable of, the sunlight exposure that we're supposed to be seeing and not seeing. Because I think I'm coming from the northern latitudes of Ireland and now living in South Texas,
yeah,
so my body is like, what is going on here, but I think it likes it. I feel better. I think it likes the sun. So I think I was just born in the wrong wrong latitude. I'm supposed to be born
well,
closer to the equator.
that was one of the most shocking statistics I ever saw was when I was looking at seasonality and COVID. You look at the black population, African American population, they were 40 times more likely to die of COVID than a sub-Saharan African. Now that, to me, should be like major alarm bells going off as to, what's going on here. Is it the environment? Is it the fact they're, like I say, been displaced to a higher latitude where they're not getting it? There was also a very interesting study where they took and they measured I believe in ratios rather than absolutes. So like for melatonin, I look at the melatonin to cortisol ratios in a lot of the stuff we're doing and trying to understand it. Because, I'm an engineer. Slope of a line means more to me than those 2 points, So I like to see slopes. But there was this really amazing study where they put at midnight, when melatonin should have been at peak, and cortisol should be at minimum. They measured, at midnight, schizophrenic and clinically depressed patients against the control. There was a 5x lower level of melatonin to cortisol ratio in the people that were suffering from depression and schizophrenia. So to your point, there's a lot of stuff we need to understand, but I do believe what they really need to do is you have to measure these things on a time scale that is appropriate. When you look at the data, these transient changes, in 10 to 20 minutes, you have a spike up, and then according, if you believe Gao's data, he was measuring sweat cortisol. What happens is that as the exercise progresses, eventually the cortisol starts to taper off. Well, melatonin is known to actually suppress ACTH, which then suppresses cortisol. And you think about it from a standpoint of what? Cortisol is very important. Adrenaline's very important. I got to get up. I got to get going, type thing. But then you don't want it to stay up. And I make the argument that what happens is blue light is a really great stimulus of cortisol. So I kind of make the point is that, our lighting and our displays and blocking the near infrared and all that from coming in is essentially creating very low melatonin to cortisol ratios on average across the band, and that we are basically turning our kids into these cortisol addicts. And because cortisol is it's a key component to addictions, and because it's usually followed by a dopamine response. So there's all these things that we need to understand about what light is doing. And I go back to the mafia is actually the first group to actually figure this all out. When they put in Las Vegas, what they found is the best way to keep people from spending money, or keep people spending money, is to have bright flashing lights, noises going off, give them some alcohol. You're going to make a ton of money. And all I'm saying is what are you doing? You're basically pumping up their cortisol levels so they're less risk averse. You're getting a dopamine kick every once in a while because somebody wins, and you basically addicted the person to doing that. And I have my grandchildren. We turn off all the TVs when they're around because I can take my 1-year-old and literally walk past a TV and she will lock into it. And I believe that the TV people know this. I mean, why do kids get locked in? So, and the same thing's happening with mothers. I mean, like I say, I don't disagree with circadian. I think it's what the body wants to do. But you got to take into account that all during the day it's doing all this. It's not following some nice smooth line. The minute you're doing it, even having sex, you're going to have all these different things. And it's unfortunate, but there's just so many, like those little dots, I call them like little points of light or whatever you want to call them, that we need to connect up. Men, have been clearly shown that if they're outside, they have higher sperm motility. They have all these other benefits associated with their testosterone levels. Watch a bunch of young guys running track after school. They take their shirts off. They get out there. Women, you turn it around, and then on women, and one of the things, my pet peeves is I wrote up this thing about cosmetics, makeup. And, there was this really great study that they did where they showed that the reactive oxygen species, half of it's generated by UV, but the other half is generated by the visible portion. So if you go and you put SPF on there and you block the UV, what do? You basically took away the mechanism that told you you're getting sunburned, because the UV generates the sunburn. But if you've taken that problem away, you spend more time out there, you're getting a lot of exposure reactive oxygen species being generated by the visible portion. And it's a different light, and it tends to localize right around the basal cells, which we're seeing increased levels of basal cell carcinoma and all this other stuff. And so again, it's the minute we start shifting things around and doing stuff, and especially with women with dark skin, they have almost zero chance of getting melanoma, but they have a whole bunch of trouble trying to generate enough vitamin D. And, therefore, if you provide makeup to everybody that has SPF, that portion of the population is negatively impacted, is my opinion. So.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And it is, I think we've got these two arguments happening, and unfortunately the loudest voice at the moment is coming from the dermatology side, where it's like, you have to wear sunscreen or you're going to end up with cancer. And my understanding of what's happening in the research now is that there can be an increase in cancers that won't kill you, I guess. But cancers that are associated with, I guess, hormones are less likely if you are actually out getting the sun's rays. So we have the focus on, because I think I was saying to you, and I hear this from moms all the time, Oh, even when I can go out, I know I have to, they're wearing factor 50 or factor 100. The kids are getting all of this lotion lashed on them as well. And then I think if the kids have been indoors probably for half of the morning and on a screen. So we have these, so we're getting them outdoors, but this fear of cancer has just got everybody with layers of clothes on them and sunscreen, and I feel like we're that narrative is, it's not getting out there that, full spectrum sunlight when done sensibly is
Yes.
so good for us.
Yeah.
and
Well, I
and
think
I
that is absolutely the most important statement to make. I mean, unfortunately, we don't think about how we collect our sunlight. I mean, the body is a solar collector. It's absolutely clear and undeniable at this point. It is using certain parts of the spectrum to do X and certain parts to do Y. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't spend all your time baking yourself for 10 days on vacation once a year or twice a year and not expect to have a problem. My wife has got red hair, fair skin. She would be picking up rocks out in Kansas in the middle of the summer, burned herself left and right. She struggles with those things. But I would say this, there is all kinds of studies that are showing that whole life or lifetime longevity is higher for people who have even gotten some level of basal cell carcinomas or things of that nature. You don't want to get melanoma, but that's, it's a trade-off too. There was a study in New York where they took a bunch of women and men that were 70, and they found that those that had had some kind of a skin cancer actually were 80% less likely to have dementia. And as I told you, optically, we are essentially collecting and putting energy into the near infrared, into the gray matter, and light piping it in. That's what's happening optically. Can't deny it, it's happening. Is it doing it just by happenstance, or is it actually something that we take advantage of? And I believe we're taking advantage of it by stimulating or at least controlling, helping the neurons do their job. And that's where there's a really, to tell you how infantile our abilities are, is that if you look at a cell, and we're just now to the point that we can actually do decent imaging of mitochondria within a cell and do time-lapse photography. There's a company called NanoLive. It does holotomography. And you can put a living cell into this microscope, and you can and you see the little mitochondria. It's a time-lapse like the old Disney pictures where they had the flowers open and all that. And it's really great. You see these things wandering around like a bunch of worms. Then you start shining lights on them. If you shine blue light on it, eventually the mitochondria start to slow down and stop. If you shine red light on it, you see that the mitochondria are just happy as me. They're just kind of at 10 times the amount of exposure level. They're just wandering around. In fact, they almost look like they accelerate. So now that's cutting edge, what we can see. And it is just, to me, the most fascinating thing that for all these decades and centuries, biology has basically poo-pooed sunlight and ignored it. We need a drug. We need this. I would make the comment that going outside with decent sunlight hygiene is probably one of the best things you can do for your children and yourself. And especially, my son was out in West Yellowstone. It's cold out there, but they get a lot of sunlight. And he was talking to one of his friends, and she was pregnant, and he was telling her about all this stuff. Next day, he saw her wandering around with her shirt up in the cold with her belly exposed. And I said, she can put her shirt down. It's okay.
Yeah, because, and that's the whole thing when you're pregnant, because the bump becomes almost public property and people just come up and touch it, so having it exposed is even more, you feel quite vulnerable about that. But interestingly, when, again, kind of coming back to pregnancy and sunlight. So there is another, I guess, some other research that I'd looked at, and it was like, oh, but if you're getting sunlight, you're more likely to get this condition called melasma, where there's kind of hyperpigmentation. You can kind of looks like kind of a mass. But then, I've also looked at come across again some of the studies on again different wavelengths, and now they were tying the melasma to blue light exposure, which I think, oh, that just makes sense, because if we're pregnant and we're sitting in front of one of these screens all day, I'm not getting the benefit of the full spectrum, then that kind of makes sense to me. But here's an interesting one. So, and from an engineering standpoint, so for postpartum moms, we're always encouraging them, in that, as they're recovering, to connect with their community, to get outdoors, get the baby outdoors, and go to these walking groups, because there is some really nice research around, again, not just automatically prescribing antidepressants for someone who's just gone through this massive life transition, that yes, some women will need them, but when we look at the evidence, it's clear that things like, exercise and, these walking groups, and I'm thinking, oh yeah, is it the exercise that's probably a contributor? But it's also those women are outdoors, they're getting all that lovely, infrared from all the trees and everything, and the grass around them. So where do these like these really bright lights come into it for like seasonal affective disorder? Are you like, would that, because I'm trying to figure out because that would be more, well, that's like bright blue light, or I'm trying to.
They're all over the map, and I can't really talk to. I believe that what you're trying to do is you're trying to get exposed to a certain ratio of near infrared to visible, and the brighter the light just means the quicker the effect, I think, more than anything else. Bear in mind that most of the PBM, most of these other things like SADs, and they need something to happen in 20 minutes. They need an effect. And so they'll jump everything up as high as they can go to get the effect, because people don't have 2 hours to sit there or 3 hours. That's why I think it's so critical that the artificial environment we're in be as close to a match as we can get it, because you're going to spend 8 hours sitting at your computer. I know. But if you have a lamp that's sitting there that's putting in some near infrared reflecting off your keyboard into your face, maybe it's going to provide you with a benefit and get you. I believe very much that we have, like I say, this reservoir that we're that's constantly being drained and filled, to deal with, because one of the things that we were able to show is that we were able to model is that you can model how light propagates in the body, but then you can, based on some work done, like I say, by Zostaro, you can actually, as a function of wavelength, predict or estimate how many reactive oxygen species are being generated. And what you see is that there is a wide range of reactive oxygen species being generated by even significant amount, even smaller levels. Bear in mind, when you're in direct sunlight, you're talking about 100,000 lux. If you're coming into shade, it's in the 10,000 to 1,000 lux. You come into a house, you're looking at 500 lux. Well, just measure. You can basically just say, okay, that's my time constant. I go out to 10 minutes out in this direct sunlight. That's kind of like 30 minutes out in the shade, and then it's kind of like 8 hours in the house. But I think that fundamentally what we're doing right now with having truncated the spectrum so much that we've created a harmful effect, that needs to be addressed immediately, in my opinion. And that's why putting yourself in the exposure to those LED lights and an environment where nothing's coming in and it's indoors. I used to say, well, we provide a light that's better. No, I'm saying we're trying to fix something that you screwed up. And, that's I don't know. I'll make this statement just because I'm kind of ticked about it right now. DOE, the Department of Energy, has now instituted a new regulation where they're basically preventing me from selling my light sources because they have near infrared content. And it's the most asinine thing I've ever seen in my life. They've been told over and over, the circadian guys have been trying to talk to them, we've been trying to talk to them, but they just, oh, we're going to put in this new standard, and it basically negates the possibility of us doing basically anything that mimics anything close to sunlight. And it's wrong, and they need to revoke it. It's what they need to do. But, you know, some of these government regulations are not just painful, they're actually causing real harm, in my opinion.
It's interesting, like, because at the time when I'm recording this, we've got all of this focus at the moment up in Capitol Hill with all of these, you know, nutritionists and people who know the science about how bad the diet is here in the US, the seed oils, all of that, the ultra processed foods. But I did see something, I think it was yesterday on Twitter, where I thought, oh, somebody is talking about mitochondria. And I think it was RFK Jr. was talking about something to do with mitochondria. I'm like, this is the first time I've heard anyone kind of in mainstream talk about mitochondria at a government level. So I thought maybe they're starting to connect the dots, but obviously not in your case. If they're, I guess, they haven't connected that dot yet with mitochondrial function and light.
Well, bear in mind that the LED lighting was like the poster child for all the green stuff going on. Unfortunately, there ended up being a bloody disaster from the standpoint that what we're showing is that, you know, they're causing harm. And if you track, you know, it's purely observational and correlation. But if you track a lot of the modern maladies that people are struggling with, it tracks exactly with the institution of complex or fluorescence and then into LEDs. And now we're starting to show. That's why I focused so much on the mechanisms, the optical mechanisms, because I hope people will look at it and say, the body went to this much trouble to do this, so why, you know, and you're saying I can just get rid of it? No. I'm all for saving the planet, but don't kill people in the process, you know.
I think that's the plan.
Yeah, I kind of think you're right, but you know, I don't know. It's just very frustrating because these government regulations they get a mind of their own. One of the things that it might have been why RFK Jr. is looking at it is there was a study in Cell. I don't know if you saw it, but of the astronauts up in the space station. Now, bear in mind that the astronauts are in an environment 100% in LED lighting. Yes, they have microgravity, they have all these other things, but they're getting fed pretty good, high-quality food, I imagine. And so, but now they're seeing they come back to Earth after 6 months or a year, and they're seeing all kinds of mitochondrial damage. Same thing's happening with submariners. Even the stealth boats, they took all the portholes out, and now they're having, within 60 days, some of these people are having mitochondrial issues.
Yeah, actually, I heard you mention this recently, and it was funny. Actually, I was listening to it when I was out walking at sunlight this morning at daybreak, and I don't know if you said it or someone else said it, but about, you know, the sailors coming back and feeling frisky after being out at sea and not having any of this, you know, full spectrum light in months. And I'm like, all I could think of, you know, from a fertility perspective was, oh, their sperm DNA is not going to be great. Like, really, they should not be going near anyone or planning any kind of family expansion or starting a family if you just come from those conditions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, that's the thing that when you start looking at it from an optics standpoint, you know, not only animals but also plants. One of the things that's really cool is Bob's been doing looking at various plant structures like mushrooms. Well, you think about it, a mushroom doesn't get direct sunlight, but it gets a lot of light from bouncing around. If you look at it optically from the shape of the mushroom, what's it doing? It's localizing the near infrared component in the spore pattern around the bottom of the mushroom to maximize fertility type things. Same thing with seeds. An olive, you know, simple little thing he's shown, you light it up, all the energy is going in right to that seed. And I just wish that guys would get it, you know. Maybe they don't, but, you know, there's clear evidence that the quality of their sperm, the motility of their sperm, you know, a lot of things are positively impacted by getting outdoors and getting some real sunlight. And, you know, we see the fertility issues, especially within the developed countries. And I know everybody wants to blame the food supply. And I'm the last person who can say anything about it because I love food. But there are thousands of different diets that are going on worldwide, and nobody's living to 120 or 130 years that I checked, you know, based on what they're eating. But sunlight is always ignored. If you go and look at the 7 whatever of the blue zones or whatever, it's everything under the sun but the fact that they're in an environment, you know, the blue zones are 37 north, or between 37 north and 17 north, you know, is where the blue zones supposedly are. But what I'd say is that if you look at it, they're outdoors a lot because it's extremely temperate. They typically tend to be around a lot of vegetation or at least ground that's reflecting. So their near infrared ratios are much higher than a lot of people. They wear light clothing, so there's a lot more penetration going on. And I would argue that, you know, why do all the people flock to Florida? You know, they know what's going on. We need to be more observational and less data driven because it's so easy to manipulate data, as our government has shown multiple times.
Yeah. And there's this other that I've come across recently, more of, you know, the light folks that I refer to, talking about POMC and the fact that we evolved to be addicted to being outdoors and that because we feel so good when we've been out getting a bit of sun. And I know, because I grew up, like my mother was a sun addict and we kind of grew up as well, like, you know, Irish people, pale skin, but we had to get a tan, you know, and we'd go to Spain for 2 weeks in the summer and everyone would fry themselves silly, but you felt great coming back, you know, and God forbid anyone in Ireland told you the weather was lovely in Ireland while you were away, because that was not allowed. But it's funny, like I heard Jack Cruz recently said something like about, again, looking at, you know, diet and light and all of the different confounders, and he said something like, you can eat that light is the most important nutrition. And literally, he says, you can eat shit in a shingle. He says, but you need to be getting the light, you know. And then I'm thinking about this what you're talking about, the mushrooms. And I feel like it's almost kind of, it says a lot about kind of where we are, I think, at the moment with all of this information. Like you know, there's a saying, and I'll bleep this out for anyone who doesn't like the spicy language, but there's a saying, you know, that about, you know, we were treated like mushrooms, like, and I feel like that's the way, like, the general public is being treated at the moment, like treated like a mushroom, kept in the dark and fed a load of shit.
Yep.
You know? But I think get that, and then I think just the idea that people don't understand the fact that, you know, that lights certain wavelengths can pass through tissue and bone and through the skull into the brain, because the idea that there are, you know, light collectors, light receptors in the brain, for me, when I heard that first, I was like, what? So we have another, it's a funny saying, but it kind of goes against everything you're saying about Irish people. So someone who wasn't very clever, we would say, there's light getting in. Light getting in somewhere, you know. So really, it's actually the opposite. You know, we want light in, and light will make you more clever.
I just think if somebody's looking for a quick fix, or, you know, it's like taking an aspirin or something for a headache, it works quick enough to where at least you convinced yourself that it was a good thing. But I think that we know enough now that you can make more optimum artificial environments to be in. You know, our modern caves are horrific. And then you start throwing in a lot of the light sources can't dim. the LEDs, or they dim only 10%. One of the things that I always appreciated about incandescents is that you could set up a system and you could dim it down to a very nice orange glow with a very romantic. It was a great thing. But now with these LEDs, they either don't dim or they dim only about 10%. So what happens? And they don't use much energy. So in everybody's, typical response, let's put more lights out. So we go start screwing bulbs into places we don't have, and now you can't dim them. So what do you have at night? I had a neighbor close to where we were, and she had this most awful, it was one of those QVC things that gave her like 20,000 lumens or something coming out of it, bright blue, screw it into the thing, and the entire neighborhood lit up. Everybody has to uplight their trees. Everybody has to, they say, well, it's not safe. I was down at Princeton University, and they had these wonderful street lights that back in Einstein's day were gas. And they had this nice, beautiful glow. Now they screw in this bulb, and it looks like a piece of junk because it's, so bright, so obtrusive. In its characteristics. It's like headlights on vehicles,
Oh, yeah. Listen, Scott, if you went to, if you were staying in an Irish home and sitting watching TV even, or, in your your living room area, it's a big deal if someone puts on the big light. Like it's really like people will get violent. If someone turn off the big light. It's a whole thing about don't never put the big light on. That's offensive in so many ways to Irish people when you put the big light on.
Yeah, well, and you think about it, you and I'm older than you by a long shot, but in my day, you had a little TV, it was about that big, CRT. It had been intentionally de-blurred so that it made more calming effect to you. It and it put out a little bit, not a lot of light, but now we've got these monsters that are putting out. Have become the major light source in a lot of rooms, and they're on continuously. They're absolutely high contrast, so that you get. I did an analysis of nature from the standpoint of frequency response modulation. And what you find is that other than a tiger about ready to eat you or a rock slide about ready to run over you, there's very little frequency content or modulation of light above 1 hertz, 1 cycle per second. But if you look at what happened with all the lighting and the displays, you're talking about, like a Philips Hue has 1,000 hertz modulation, so it can do red, green, blue, all of every color under the sun, is going on constantly. Now, there was this really great study where they actually measured the cell wall potential, voltage potential on a single cell. It was great work. And he turned the light on and off, LED on and off. 1 hertz response in the voltage. So literally, it may not be affecting your eye, but your cells are literally being fluctuated electrically by turning these flashing lights that everybody's got. There was a day where compact or fluorescents were forced to go up to 10 kilohertz so that people wouldn't be responding negatively, and some still did then. Now we've got everything anywhere from 60 hertz to 1,000 hertz, and it's okay. It's not okay. So I think there's just a lot that we underestimate how light impacts us. And all I'm saying is we're looking at it optically, and I think every time I turn around, I'm just absolutely fast. When you look at into a lot of the different, even deeper into the structures, you find that there's these what they call a periodic structure, and it's an index refraction difference, and it's built by the body to make these little structures. It's key to making telecommunications work, Bragg gratings and things of that nature. But the body's been doing it for millions of years, and what does it do? It localizes photons in a certain place where there happens to be some kind of a chromophore or whatever. Those things, the body is, as Bob likes to say, you know, the more we are at a constant level of increasing complexity for the opportunity to survive, basically. And so you see all these mechanisms. Now you start screwing around with what you're exposing them to, that millions of years depended on that light called sun, that you're starting to really mess with some stuff that you shouldn't be messing with. But practically speaking, you know, if I could just convince, you know, and this is really hard, especially within the inner city, to getting more time outdoors in a safe manner. You know, unfortunately, it's not that safe anymore. But and get better at turning lights off rather than trying to be cute and have them dim. Just turn the dumb thing off, you know, and get some, turn the TV off, you know, things of that nature. It's hard, and I don't do it well, but I think that one of the problems is we haven't had enough science to say what the consequence is in order to fix it. So.
Yeah, I was really fascinated when that the NASA study, and I think, you know, that they were saying the astronauts were almost pre-diabetic from, and I was like, oh, so of course my midwife's hat is going, oh, come on now, because with, you know, metabolic disease and pregnancy, and then what we don't want to be doing is, you know, when we look at this concept of fetal programming, that it's not just my exposure to artificial light that's being impacted, you know, that it's, you know, am I, you know, is this feeding into my baby's metabolic functioning when it's, you know, out in,
Well, I mean, my understanding from the literature is that a baby is totally dependent on mom for melatonin for the first 6 months or whatever, and you know how strongly that is imprinted on the child probably has a huge effect on over a lifespan, you know.
yeah,
And so, I mean, so many things. I mean, birth is the most miraculous thing in the world, you know, but, you know, why would we put her in, you know, hospitals? It used to be, you know, you were talking about I was talking to a friend of mine, Mark Cooper. He's an expert on vitamin D. And he was telling stories about his grandparents. A grandpa, I think, was in the Merchant Marines. And the life expectancy in the Merchant Marines was about 3 years, because they would put all these guys down in the bottom of these holds, delivering goods for the war, and you know they would catch TB, they would catch all these diseases. Well, what they did is they took some of the old forts that from the cowboy and Indian days, and they converted them into sanitariums, where they would take these people and they would get them sunlight. So, you know, and Rogers talked a lot about this, that there used to be a time where solariums and people would go to get well at higher altitudes and all these things where they were getting more sunlight. They would literally roll them out. Even the Maasai and places like that in Africa, they still take their patients, you know, even in the village, they'll take people who aren't feeling well and set them outside for a little bit. And, you know, does it solve the problem? Does it mean that all the pharmaceuticals need to shut their doors? No, it means that the body is not incapable of healing itself to a great extent. And in some ways I got in trouble because I told the PBM guys, so let me get this right, you're just trying to accelerate something that's going to happen anyway. So, you know, that's what didn't go over well. But, you know. I don't know. I just think that everything, the seasonality and all these things, the more we can set our body up to being able to defend itself, and light is an important part of that equation, then you're much more likely to prevent diseases, you know. And I'm at this present time, I'm really fascinated with all these microstructures that I'm finding, or nanostructures that I'm finding in the body. If you look at the rods inside your eye, there's 100 and some odd discs that are separated by just on the order of 30 nanometers. And there are hundreds of them. And that's how we actually see, is those photoreceptors in those little structure. Same thing happens with photosynthesis. There's all these different structures where it will basically absorb light of one wavelength but transmit or reflect other ones. So the green you see in a tree is actually coming from a periodic structure inside the cell, inside the leaf itself, that is highly reflective to the green component. And it's like I say, we're so far behind as far as understanding.
But we're learning, and I think like the combination of of some of the other experts that you're kind of now have now teamed up with, I think great. This is going to push this research out into the mainstream more quickly. We hope.
Yeah.
But funnily enough, when you were talking about what we used to do years ago, and years ago as well, like if we had a baby that was a little bit jaundiced, we would put the baby we won't say we. The common theory was that the baby could go, in the window if we didn't take baby outside. If the baby was at the window, and we used to get the baby some sunlight, and that'll help, with the bilirubin levels. But now it's like, no, because of first of all, the windows with the coverings,
it blocks the UV and blocks the near infrared.
Yeah, so you can open the window, but then again, there's that fear of, no, your baby's going to get sunburned and it's going to get all kinds of things. And so now now we'd rather put the babies under these really high intensity blue, what we call billy blankets.
Yeah.
But it's again with kind of little things that, like, my grandmother would have said, yeah, let's take the baby out in the garden for a little bit. And when we look in countries like, some of the Scandinavian countries where they will still today like put babies out in cold weather but they're in the open, and they're getting all that great daylight as well, which I think.
Yeah, I think one of the things I thought was just absolutely amazing is that when you think of sunlight, we think of a direct interaction with the body type thing. You're getting into the thing. But it turns out that sunlight is doing a lot more. What you find is a professor, he did a study, and what happens is that during the day, as the sunlight levels increase, the level of hydrogen peroxide and ozone increases up to a point to where it starts out in the morning, and by the time 1 o'clock, it reaches a level that is actually germicidal. So nature's got her little lights. By the time it gets to the evening, that drops off. Well, what happens is that the microbes in the soil go into respiration when the sunlight goes away, because they've been storing up all this energy, and they release nitric oxide into the atmosphere at, again, germicidal levels, and also affecting, how you sleep. So when we think about sunlight, we need to think about not just as a direct impact, but how it's creating an environment in which we were supposed, for millions of years, survived by all these effects. Now, I'm not saying it was perfect, but now if we go into what happens is that there's this big push now that we're going to increase the number of air exchanges in hospitals and schools, and we're going to get the particle counts down and all this other stuff. Well, the one thing that guarantees is that you wipe out all these reactive oxygen species that are outside, because it's going to filter. They're going through all these filters. And so it essentially takes away, and you think about it, there are trillions and trillions and trillions of pathogens that the body is exposed to all day. When we did a series of computational fluid dynamic models of the effect, and the most effective way to prevent somebody from getting sick is to have this level of reactive oxygen species, because what happens is, as the droplet moves from the person coughing to the other, the only thing fast enough was the fact that it was collecting the reactive oxygen species as it moved through. And the smallest particles picked up the fastest because they have a higher surface area to volume ratio. And so that's what was, and you think about that and you think, that's so cool, that's interesting. But if we'd have known that, we wouldn't have put people in a bunch of apartments with all this climate control stuff going on. We would have found other ways to get them out and separated. And the study was basically for 6 foot. We were looking at how quickly, and it takes less than a second for a droplet to move from this person to that person. But in that time, if you have a certain level, the natural levels of reactive oxygen, it was sufficient to deactivate it based on some of Fauci's data. But, like I say, the deeper you dig, the more you get a sense that there is very much a guiding hand in this whole thing, and that, trying to mess around and do something different than nature. I'm not saying it's not always the case, but most of the time you're playing with something. You're playing with fire. You don't know what you're dealing with, and that's what ticks me off about these government regulation stuff. They don't care about the science at all. They just have to make a number, and it's pathetic. Anyway.
So Scott, you cannot sell your products now, or because I was going to, as we wrap up, I want to share kind of where people can find you.
No, we can sell them. I haven't done Europe because you guys are 220 and I'm 120, and so we had that. But now we've developed essentially an adapter where we have a little wall wart that converts it into DC, and then you have zero flicker, and you get the combination. We now have that, and we're going to put it online here soon to where you could buy that and you could do something over in Europe. What happens if the rule change stands in 2028, they would find me to actually sell my product, basically, is what it looks like. And, now, will we get around it? I hope we don't have to, because to me, we started out with the simple screw bases for the A19s and the BR30, the old Edison bulbs that everybody had. I did that purposely because I believe very strongly that the black community has the biggest need, and therefore and especially people in low income areas, whether independent of whether they're black or not. So if we can get those in, there's 1 billion of those sockets out there. And, maybe we can make a difference. We don't claim anything medically. We don't do anything. I'm just telling you, it's the closest match to sunlight. And eventually I hope to add even back a little bit of UV, which is really going to make the dermatologist people go crazy, but they're wrong. Anyway.
You heard it here first.
Yeah, well.
Scott, you're wrong. But it is, I think it's I don't go down the conspiracy theories very often, but it is almost like when I hear those kinds of regulations, it's almost as if the government wants to keep you sick.
Yeah, well, it was one of those things that it had great intentions, and it did do something, but it's frustrating because the DOE spent millions and millions of dollars on developing these LEDs, never once looking at whether or not there was a health aspect to it, because they had been chartered to get the efficiency up to so many lumens per watt. Now, that's great and dandy, and they did some great things, but number one, they didn't take into account our stuff and what we're trying to do, and the fact that it isn't sunlight. And number two, it ended up all going over to Asia for the manufacturing, so what in the heck was the point in the first place? And it's just a shame, because it's clearly, and I'm not being negative towards them particularly. Well, I am, yeah. So what? We had incandescent bulbs that were, gotten to the point that they used almost zero materials. They were very lightweight. I call them lumens per gram. Now we replaced it with these big honking light with heat sinks and all this other stuff and electronics. They don't work well as far as their dimming range, and they are almost all near infrared. They used to be all near infrared. So, was it such a terrible thing? I don't think so. And while we do it, it's easy to see. We just take, LEDs are good at generating visible light. They're lousy at generating near infrared. Little incandescent filaments like you used to have in your little flashlight. Mm-hmm. They're 100% efficient at generating near infrared. We put two of them together in a little bulb and we screw it in and it lights up. That's all we're doing. It's not rocket science, but it matches the spectrum from all the way out to 3,000 nanometers that you get when you're in the shade. as close as anybody else. So.
Scott, where can people buy these bulbs?
Our company website is Nira, Nira, lighting.com. And we're a small company, two-person company, so I build them. So when you order, don't expect me to. For Europe, if you could, if you could buy the one that's the adapter, that'll be up on the website next week or so. So you can plug it in anywhere in Europe, because ultimately I see, at least in my vision, I'd like to see us eventually get to the point that we move more and more to a DC, a direct current type approach, because even a little bit of flicker is, my opinion, is unnecessary. You're going to get it with your TV and your laptop, whether you like it or not. But, why add it in if you don't need to? And I think that there's some real advantages, renewables. If DOE had spent half the money on convincing people to turn their lights off at night for good health, we'd be in a lot better shape. But I do give the artificial light at night, dark sky people a lot of credit. I mean, I love to see the Milky Way, and I'm hopeful. But as long as we keep on giving them the stuff we've been giving them, people are just going to keep screwing it into the outside of their buildings. So
yeah.
Anyway.
Listen, Scott, thank you so much. I know it's kind of gone over our time, but it's such an important topic, I think, and it's not being talked about around women's reproductive health anyway. I really want to kind of get as much of this information out there so people can start making informed decisions about their light diet, never mind their nutrition that they're eating, to get pregnant and enjoy their pregnancy. But I just don't think enough people realize how important this is, and hopefully we can share a little bit more today and get people's interest peaked to go down a few of those many rabbit holes that I've gone down in the last year or so.
Well, thank you, and for all the midwives that you kind of represent. I mean, I think that's a tough gig, and but I do believe, at the end of the day, a little common sense, a little bit of moderation, a consistency, especially during the pregnancy, are things that, if it feels good, go outside and enjoy it. As you say, it makes you happy. And especially when the kids, I don't want anybody to go out and sunburn their child or whatever. It's under the shade. Have a hat. Do that kind of stuff. Enjoy it. Get their feet a little dirty. I had one gentleman that that his son had cancer, and he said, Scott, I never really thought about it, but every day I would take the boy out and let him run in the outside and get dirty and all that. And he says, I wonder, did it help? I think it did. And I think that we'll eventually figure out that, used to be that was the only thing that the medical community had to use was sunlight and solarium. Then they beat it back and put all those people out of business. Now I think we're going to get to pendulum's going to swing back into the middle, hopefully, and get something that's good on both ends of the spectrum. So,
thank you again. Yeah, thank you for all of your work, and best of luck with all of your future endeavours. And hopefully the government will soon see sense in this misguided approach that they're taking to light as only something for vision and not for health.
Yeah, well, American politics, I'm not so sure.
Well, we're about to find out.
Yeah, we are.
Thank you, Scott. It's been great. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. Remember, empowerment begins with knowledge. If you enjoyed our time together and want more content like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. So stay inspired, stay informed, and until next time, take care of yourself.